Hello again, friends, and welcome to Diving Deeper, Episode 6. In this episode, I want to talk about something we touched on briefly in Episode 2, and that is heroes of the faith, people that have embodied a particular trait or just the entirety of the Bible, and that we now look up to them as exemplars of how we should behave. And I thought it would be appropriate to do this with a focus on the Beatitudes and the character traits listed within. What we're going to talk about today, as always, I will introduce the concept, give a little bit of background, and then we'll go into the actual content. There are three in particular that I would like to discuss. Their names are Dirk Willems, Brother Andrew, and James and Elizabeth Elliot, who are grouped together, but I suppose if you really count, that makes four. And then we will conclude with some summarizing thoughts. As we covered previously, a lot of this is material that was discussed in episode 2. If you don't recall, that was the one where we talked about importance of stories and sharing those stories with our children, future generations. This is very much along the same lines, but we're going to talk specifically about a few stories. What I have outlined here really just says human culture has always done this. Human culture has always shared legends about people that embody whatever that culture thinks is super important. And we would typically call those people legends or heroes and things like that. And the men and women that I will bring up today, I would argue, are heroes of the faith. The first story I want to cover requires quite a bit of background information to fully understand, so I'm going to ask that you grab a notebook and maybe take some notes or just listen carefully because it does get a little bit complicated. But I want to start with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. In that, Martin Luther, if you look at the church that he started, the Lutheran Church, and you were to compare that, even the modern Lutheran Church, to a Catholic Church, the differences are relatively minimal. Luther effectively said, I disagree with the authority of the Pope. One man should not have absolute authority in the church. And I disagree with the abuses of the church at the time. Indulgences is a big one that he said this is not acceptable. But there were, of course, 95 Theses. All these things he says are wrong with the church. But in general, he says, I don't disagree with the Catholic Church and its structure. I disagree with these few abuses. I think church is on the right track. It's just gotten a little bit diverted by poor leadership, whatever. Well, because he opened that door and said the Catholic Church is wrong in these areas, there were plenty of follow on reformers that said, okay, the church is also wrong in all these areas. And that's where we get a lot of the more modern, or what we would perceive as a more modern denominations. You had reformers like Calvin and Zwingli, etc., and they were a little bit more radical than Luther in saying, okay, here's all these other things that are also wrong with the Catholic Church. And you go to like a Wesleyan church or something, and they're very different than a Catholic Church in a lot of ways. Well, throughout that, you enter a man named Menno Simons. Menno Simons was really radical compared to his contemporaries. He effectively said the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, that chunk of scripture, Jesus' words there, he meant every single word completely literally. That is how you are to behave. That is to govern all human interactions. He believed that was kind of a Bible within a Bible. And from that, he had a couple of other beliefs. I guess adjacent to that, he had a couple of other beliefs. The biggest and most objectionable of which were pacifism. All Menno Simons followers, who became known as Anabaptists initially and then eventually Mennonites and the Amish, are kind of a sect of that. They're all pacifists. They completely do not agree with any violent action of a Christian in any case. The other big tenet of Menno Simon's faith and interpretation of the Bible was that baptism is reserved for consenting adults. It requires you to understand what's going on and affirm that you are a believer and so on, much like we, in fact, believe today. Well, these two beliefs together, pacifism and adult baptism, made the Anabaptists objectionable to pretty much everybody. Nobody liked them. The state didn't want them because they wouldn't serve in a military if they needed to, and the church didn't like them because they objected to the church's statute of baptism, and they wouldn't baptize their infants. This was still in a time where there was a lot of persecution if you were not the in group, so to speak, and so the Anabaptists were brutally persecuted in a lot of ways. That's actually why there's so much movement in those families. If you look, you start out typically in Switzerland, like Menno Simons was Swiss, and then they just move around from there. So the family would start in Switzerland and then end up somewhere in Germany or France. Eventually, a lot of them moved to the States because theoretically there was less persecution here. That's not really true if you look at history, but at least initially it was true. So you have this sect of Christianity called the Anabaptists. Nobody likes them. They're perpetually being persecuted. The 16th century, 1500s, was a particularly bad time for that. That was when they were really, really getting started. The church was taken off, and the other denominations in the state were really trying to quash it because, like I said, nobody liked them. Well, here you can see Dirk Willems, the first person I want to talk about, was born in 1501. So, right kind of as this whole thing is coming to a head and starting to peak. Dirk was a Dutch Anabaptist. He was in the Netherlands, and he is eventually discovered. He has been baptized as an adult by his father, and then following that, he is baptizing other people in his home, which was illegal at the time. And he refuses to recant. He says, "No, my interpretation of the Bible is correct. You guys are wrong." For this, he's thrown in jail. Well, eventually, he makes good his escape using a rope made of knotted rags to descend the castle wall into the moat, which is frozen, it's apparently winter. And he's running along the ice on top of the moat and is pursued by a guard. The guard notices he's running along behind. Dirk, because he's been imprisoned for a few months now, is pretty emaciated. He's pretty light. He just runs right across the top of the ice, no problem. Prison guard, on the other hand, probably armed, also much better fed and heavier, breaks through the ice. Dirk perceives that the prison guard is in a bad situation. He's not going to make it. He's probably going to die if someone doesn't help him. And he goes, turns around, runs back to the prison guard, and unlike a normal human being who would step on his head, shove him under the ice, and then run the other way, Dirk helps the guy out, saves his life. Okay? For that merciful act, he is not freed. He is not shown further mercy. He is thrown back in jail, tortured, and then eventually martyred. Martyred by being burned at the stake. His crime was persisting obstinately in his opinion. The more I think about it, the more I think that would be a great epitaph to have on your tombstone, and in fact, to earn, persisting obstinately in his opinion or his faith. Anyway, I tell that story because it actually, at first glance, seems to be a bit contrary to the Beatitudes, where we read, "Blessed are the merciful," or "the good life is for the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." That was absolutely not true in Dirk's case. 100%, he acted in an incredibly courageous and merciful way, and for that was thrown in jail and eventually burned at the stake. So what gives? Well, one, I would argue that "for they will be shown mercy" is true in the kingdom of heaven, may not always be true on earth because we are very much not the kingdom of heaven. We are very imperfect, etc. But I think the important part to remember is not the end result for Dirk, because that was a very horrible end, but that he so strongly believed that first section, that the good life is for the merciful, that he was willing to risk what did eventually happen to him. Because you got to think he probably knew. He probably knew what was going to happen if he went back to save that man. He was risking his own life in the immediate fact of he might break through the ice too and then drown, but also he's putting himself back in the mercy of people who are not merciful. And he knew them to not be merciful in personal experience. But he says, "It is important to me. It is my faith. It is what I have been taught to do the right thing, regardless of the outcome in this situation. And the right thing in this case is to save this man." And so he does. This story has actually become, as I said before, kind of a folk legend in the Mennonite church. Dirk Willems is the closest thing you will ever find to a saint. The Mennonites do not recognize saints, but if they did, he would be in there, and it would be a pretty short list. This is a legend they tell to their kids, and something that they would say, "If you want to know what we believe and how you should behave, here you go. This is it." The second story I want to cover also requires a little bit of background information to fully understand. And this will probably mean a lot more to some of you than it does to me, as some of you are a little bit older and kind of lived through some of this. But set the scene sometime after the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, a lot of Europe, particularly the western portion, went to a capitalist free market kind of society similar to America. Well, the counterpoint to that was the eastern portion of Europe under Soviet control, and the Soviets were staunchly communist. Everything was state controlled, state run. They called this divide the Iron Curtain. It was popularized by Winston Churchill, actually, in a speech. But the idea was ideologically, behind the Iron Curtain, everything is very different. As I said, it's very communist, it's all state controlled. And in a state controlled government, religion was, at least in this particular state controlled government or system, religion was something to be very tightly controlled. States and religion do not typically mix very well. Christianity did not flourish in that environment, at least not state run Christianity. The person that I want to talk about here was named Brother Andrew, or at least he was called Brother Andrew because of what he was engaged in. So during the 60s and 70s, he dedicated his life to smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain. He would jam pack his little Volkswagen Beetles, what he started with printed Bibles in various languages, and he would just drive straight into the communist bloc countries and via the spirit basically figure out who to give them to. And he would just hand these suckers out. I have titled this slide Blessed Are the Meek for a really interesting reason. And I guess extra background here, all of this information comes from the book that Brother Andrew actually wrote at the time. It's called God's Smuggler. It is probably the most compelling and also convicting read that I have ever had the pleasure of reading. It was amazing. But anyway, it I say blessed are the meek because his actions were incredibly meek in that he always says, I don't have to try hard. I don't have to be some brilliant smuggler for this to work if God wants it to work. To the extent that he basically didn't even try to hide the Bibles, right? He's very much smuggling contraband. These are illegal. If he gets caught, he's in huge trouble, probably persecution, potentially death in certain situations. And he has the audacity to go through these checkpoints and these border crossings with a Bible sitting on the passenger seat of his car. Because again, he says, if God wants them to be blind and not see it, then they will. And if he doesn't, then it doesn't really matter what I'm going to do because they'll find me anyway. And so he just, in a very meek way, puts absolutely everything in God's control. So much so that that book that I mentioned, his book, God's Smuggler, he wrote that while still engaged in this activity of smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain. It was required reading for every KGB agent. They had to know who this guy was, what he was doing, and attempt to find him and stop him. And yet, they never did. He wrote a book and said, basically waving it in their faces, this is what I'm doing behind your Iron Curtain. I am smuggling Bibles in because you cannot stop the good word. You cannot stop the gospel from spreading. I don't care how much you try, how much you think your state run can run everything. It can't. Right? The good news marches on. The state sees that. They say every single agent out there is going to read this book. They're going to be on top of this guy. They're going to be all over him. They never got close. Because, as you see the verses that I have listed there, Brother Andrew actually references them in the back of his book, right? God makes seeing eyes blind, and he makes the wisdom of the wise into foolishness. And he absolutely did that in this case. And it is an absolutely incredible read because again and again and again, he just says, if God's in it, it's going to work and I don't have to try. And if God's not in it, there's no point. Doesn't matter how hard I try, it's not going to work. Bear in mind that through all this, the guy that's actually doing the smuggling, he was prior effectively Special Forces Army. So he's someone that could have come up with some great plans, really done some sophisticated operations to get those Bibles in there. He knew what he was doing in that kind of world. And instead of relying on his own strength, his own wisdom, and his own knowledge and experience, he just says, nope, God's got it. Or he doesn't. But I'm going to live in faith, in meekness, either way. The final group that I want to talk about today requires no introduction, and in fact, you're probably already familiar with their story, but I want to cover it again just because it is such an incredible testament of God's power in even the most horrible situations. And in addition to that, people who understand what it is to suffer, to be reviled, and yet know that ending of the Beatitudes that says, this is the good life. It is a blessing when people revile you. And so, again, effectively, no introduction required, but I want to talk very briefly about Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. They were missionaries to Ecuador in the 1950s. They worked pretty extensively in that area at the time, but there was one tribe in particular that they really had a heart to reach because that tribe was considered to be the most violent, the most aggressive, they're just the most egregious perpetrators of human abuse in the area. And so they said those are the group that needs the gospel the most. And that's where they really wanted to target. That tribe is called the Aucas, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. But anyway, you get the idea. The story really unfolds where they spend a few years down there. They're making a lot of progress with some of the other local tribes, the more peaceable ones, and they start making inroads with the Aucas. This is a time the only access they have anywhere is a small bush plane that they're flying around, and they had like a wired telephone they would drop from the plane, and they'd fly in circles, and you could talk to whoever was on the ground. And they're flying over and they're dropping messages and giving gifts and stuff, and they do that for a while. Eventually, they get to a point where they want to establish basically a forward base that is close to the Aka village. And at that time, there were four men. I think they were all married. And they move into this forward base for a brief period. And eventually, it ends that they're all four killed by this tribe of natives. And that, of course, is very sad. The story actually just explodes globally. Everybody sees it. It's on Time magazine. It becomes this huge deal. Later on down the road, they actually made a movie of it. It's called Tip of the Spear. What's really compelling about this story is then a few years later, Elizabeth Elliot, Jim Elliot's wife, and remember, Jim was one of the ones who was murdered by these people. His wife Elizabeth actually gets an opportunity through some new connections in the village to move in with them. She's invited to go and live with them and bring her family. They got two kids. And she does so with the wife of the other missionary that was married. I believe her name was Rachel Saint. Doesn't matter. Anyway, they actually move into this village and then they start just doing missionary stuff, right? They're sharing the gospel. They do eventually reach them, they convert them. It's this incredible story of seeing the suffering and the end of the Beatitudes where it says very clearly this is not necessarily a bad thing if you're seeing this prejudice and this persecution. Well, they have an incredible come about because of it. And there is this one section at the very end of her book. It's called Through Gates of Splendor. Also a fantastic read. I do recommend. Elizabeth Elliot. She just makes an observation where she says, I'm now sitting in this mud hut writing this book while next door my children are being watched by the man who murdered their father. And that is just such an incredible picture of the change that is possible with God's help through the gospel when we are willing to just do what he tells us to do. I, it's hard to imagine having that level of faith of either Jim or Elizabeth Elliot to do that, to risk your life in those situations, flying into those crazy bush places and trying to reach those natives, and then eventually watching your spouse get murdered by them and then moving into that village afterwards is not something that I think many of us would claim to have the faith to do, but that's exactly what happens in this case, and the result is very incredible. And like I said, it was actually a global light for the gospel because this story just blew up. It went everywhere. Probably the saddest part of the whole story, other than the general narrative of this missionary being killed, is actually that you find out in the end they weren't really. the villagers, that is, weren't really trying to be aggressive in that way necessarily. They were just scared by that, the plane. They didn't know what the heck it was. They thought these people were like demons, because that's a lot of cultures in that area. The fair skinned people were demon possessed or ghosts or something. The whole thing, the whole murders that went down, it really ended up being this horrible misunderstanding. I mean, it was very, very sad in the end, where you just can't help but think, well, if they had known, that is, if Jim and his associates had known how to better approach this, there might have been a very different ending, where they could still be, well, not now, but they could have for many years been alive and well and on to do more. But that's not how it ended. That isn't what God chose to do, to make happen in this case, and it did still come to an incredible ending. I have also listed here probably one of Jim Elliot's most famous quotes, and it is one that has stuck with me verbatim since I read this book, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, maybe. Uh, and he says, this is quoted as they're preparing to go and live close to the Akka village. Not when they were going to live there, but when Jim and his associates have built this forward base, and they're going to basically put themselves in harm's way in hopes of getting a better opportunity to witness to these villagers. And, his wife Elizabeth says, what if you die? There's a very real possibility here. You might not survive this. And he says, if that's what it takes to bring the gospel to these people, then I will gladly die to do it. And then she quotes something that he wrote in a notebook in college, and it says, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. I have always found that to be just such an incredibly succinct and compelling idea, that it's not foolishness to give up your life, which you cannot keep anyway, to gain eternal salvation that you can never lose. It just puts it in such great perspective, and it's very obvious that's how Jim Elliot lived his life. It wasn't just some quote that he thought was great and he put on a pillow, right? This is how he lived his life, and that's pretty incredible. That is all the stories that I have to cover for today. I do want to wrap up real quick with two final thoughts, and that is that hopefully these stories have given you some idea that it is in fact possible to live the beatitudes out. Menno Simons would argue that's the 100% unarguable expectation. Whether or not you believe that to be accurate, it is very clearly possible to live these virtues out in the world that we live in, and to have it make an amazing impact on the world. It might cost you your life, but as Jim Elliot clearly understood, that is worth it. The second point that I want to make, and the reason that I use the Elliot's story, is that all three of these people and or groups were just that. They were just people. You probably won't find much dirt on Dirk Wilhelm, because it was so long ago that the only thing we pretty much have on him is what's recorded in the story about the martyrs. That, I told you that whole story. That's pretty much all we've got on the guy. But you look at Brother Andrew's story, for example, he's a little bit more recent, and there isn't a ton, but there is a decent amount of people who disagree with his beliefs, things that he did, the actions that he took, yada, 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 right? Very clearly was a real human being, and he made mistakes, did things wrong, and yet was used so powerfully for the gospel in a very powerful, very global way. He even went on to lead ministries, once the Iron Curtain fell and you could freely trade Bibles in the communist countries in Europe. He then went on to, how do we smuggle Bibles into China? And he's like shipping entire container ships full of Bibles into China, working with a bunch of big global organizations doing that sort of thing. And then move on to the Elliots. Like I said, that's why I use their story. Elizabeth Elliot did eventually leave the mission field in, I think it was like the late 50s or possibly the 1960s. And she actually became a pretty prominent feature of the Protestant Christian movement in America. She actually became pretty polarizing too. She had some beliefs that people really didn't agree with, that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. And some of the people that she chose to associate with, same kind of thing. It just rub people the wrong way. There's some argument that, oh, she left the mission field not because she felt like God was calling her back, but because she just couldn't get along with Rachel Saint, the other missionary's wife who was there at the time. I don't want to get into the dirt. I don't think it's worth it. It's not a great exercise, but it's interesting to know this is a real human being. This is somebody with faults and flaws. She struggled with XYZ problem. She had this belief that you could argue is maybe wrong, whatever, right? Real human being, believed the scriptures, believed the beatitudes is how we live, and made an amazing impact for God in Ecuador. And then even if there were faults in her ministry that I'm sure you could find, right, had a huge impact in the States as well. At one point at a previous church, I referenced that exact quote by Jim Elliot to the pastor, and he said, "Oh, you read the book? That's so good. I really enjoyed it." And then he made a really interesting comment. He said, "Yeah, one time I was doing sound at a speaking engagement for Elizabeth Elliot. This again was probably when she was like in her 70s or 80s. And my pastor said, even then, even this older, relatively frail lady, she was just somebody that had this incredible presence. She walks in the room and everybody feels it right away. Somebody that just took command of the room, had this incredible presence, had this incredible witness that she could give, and could really, really control an audience, could really sway you towards the gospel. So, someone that was very imperfect, like we said, there's arguments as to whether she left the mission field on good terms or not, whatever, was used very powerfully for the gospel for her whole life. As always, I thank you most sincerely for your time, for listening to me ramble on about a few of my personal heroes of the faith for probably close to half an hour now. I think it makes a difference when we think about people that have gone before, that have done this race, that figured out how to do it well. I think, at least personally, I find it to be very encouraging. Even if their stories didn't always end well on this side of heaven, we know that it is going to be great in the other side of eternity. So, thank you for your time. I do have a little bit of homework this time. I would love, love, love to hear from you. What stories did you grow up hearing about missionaries, Bible or not Bible? What stories were those heroes of the faith to you? Did you grow up listening to your pastor say, somebody in particular, maybe it's a small time guy that maybe didn't make the news, but it was just an incredible story to hear. I know Peter referenced some friends of his a couple of weeks ago. That was a really encouraging story to hear, and it was not one that I was familiar with because it wasn't something that had made global news or I had known prior to that. So I'd love to hear more if you guys have them. I know some of you probably were in the mission field at some point in time. If you have those stories, I would love to hear them and catalog them and use them if I could to encourage others. So whatever you think is appropriate. If you want to email me, you want to talk to me on Sunday or something, I'd love to hear from you. I absolutely love to hear these stories all the time. And then when you do that, if you go through those stories and you're thinking about them, just think about, if I had to say that person, that group, whoever really embodied one or two of the Beatitudes, they clearly felt this was their life verse, so to speak. Not that I necessarily agree with that idea, but if that's true, if there's one or two that you could distill their experience down to, which would it be and why? Why would you say, like I did with Dirk, it was pretty obvious that mercifulness was really important to him, so much so that he was willing to risk his life for it and eventually give it up for it. Or Brother Andrew, who, like I said, was very, very meek. He did not have to be, he was someone that we would consider from a human perspective to have a lot of smarts in the area that he was operating in, and he totally gave all that up and just operated 100% on faith, which is a very meek way to behave. So do that same kind of analysis and just let me know, what do you think for your personal heroes of the faith? Finally, as always, these are my references for today. This is where I drew the information that I presented, or at least most of it. These are books that I have read for the most part. I have not read all of Mirror of Martyrs. That's just a compilation that was written in the 17th century of martyrs from the beginning of church history to that point. And rather depressingly, it's extremely long. Even though especially once the Anabaptists came on the scene. It really focused on them. Even with just their stories, it still is a very, very long read. God's Smuggler is, as I said earlier, Brother Andrew's account of really his whole life, but he focuses on his activities smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain. And what I said was it is an incredibly compelling and convicting read. That is because just the incredible faith that he displays again and again and again throughout the work. Not always in these incredible life or death situations where, if God doesn't protect me, I'm gonna die or I'm gonna be found out kind of thing. Even in little stuff where he describes what he calls the kingly way, right? That is God's way, and what he says is basically God owns everything. In effect, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, to quote Proverbs or possibly Psalms. Um, anyway, right? God has access to all of the resources ever, and so there shouldn't be a lack when you're working in ministry. There is a lot of thought in ministry and missions, etc., that just we always have to be incredibly frugal. We have to really scrimp. We never ever get anything nice for ourselves, etc., etc. And it's not wrong to be frugal. I certainly don't think, but he makes the point that we serve the King who owns everything. So what reason is there to effectively punish ourselves unnecessarily when he can provide anything? And he goes through his experience with that and then relates it to the law in Leviticus and says you should not muzzle the ox when he's treading the grain. And someone even confronts him with that at one point in his ministry and says, you're not thinking about this right. If you really think about it, it is okay to allow yourself to live a little bit, basically. So really interesting read. I highly recommend it. It isn't all that long. You can probably go through it in a couple of days. If you're a quick reader, you can get the audiobook. It's great. The reason it's so compelling is that it, from start to finish, the book reads like fiction. You're going to say, there's no way this is real story. Like, this is not, someone wrote this down, out of their mind. It isn't really something that happened, but it is 100% factual. He wrote down the story of his life, and it's just incredible from page one to the very end. The final book there, Through Gates of Splendor, is Elizabeth Elliot's account of going down to Ecuador to minister to the natives down there, and then eventually when her husband and those other missionaries are killed. And the final conclusion is when they eventually move into that village and start the ministry and convert those people. It is also a great read. She has a lot of really compelling things to say. It's a really interesting story. There's been a lot of critique of it, particularly of Jim Elliot, all these kinds of things. I have no interest whatsoever in going into any of those critiques. I just think it's an interesting and compelling story, and it does say a lot about the faith and what's expected of us. So, good read, definitely recommend. I don't know about her other books. I know she did write quite a few. She was an author for a lot of years in the States. I have not read any of them, and so I cannot speak to their accuracy. As I said before, there is also a film based on this story. I misquoted earlier. It is The End of the Spear, not Tip of the Spear. Tip of the Spear is the movie about a Green Beret. I've never seen that one. I have seen End of the Spear, although it was quite a while ago. As I recall, it was done relatively well, at least as far as relatively low budget Christian films go. It was pretty good. Probably the most interesting fact about End of the Spear, the film that was based on this story, is that it was actually pushed not by some American publishing house or anything like that. It was actually pushed by the natives in Ecuador because as they kind of grew into the spotlight and started getting more communication and whatnot from the outside world, they saw the violence and the depravity in the Western world and said they need to see this story, which is a bit of a slap in the face to the Western world that these what we would consider to be savages, though we don't use that word anymore, but you get the idea, right? These natives that are living in the jungle basically and hunting with spears and all that kind of stuff, and they walk around basically naked. Like they saw our society and said, "Oh my gosh, those people need the gospel." That's a very much a reversal of the roles, but it's interesting to think about.